If I loan out $100,000 to 10 people
Okay.
at 1% interest each, that means among them there's $1 million in that society.
Right.
100,000 times 10 is a million. And even at 1% interest, I'm a nice banker, right?
Okay. Right. Right.
That means each one of you will have to pay back $101,000.
Okay.
All right, so
Gotcha.
collectively you owe $1,010,000.
Okay.
The problem is, as a group, you only have $1 million. How do you guys all pay your debt off if that group only has $1 million? You can't. It's a mathematical
so
they call it usury.
So if someone were to invest in my company,
That's a totally different thing.
okay, what kind of interest are you talking about?
Well, first of all, like, just because somebody wants to get paid for giving money,
Right.
that doesn't give you permission to victimize other people.
Yeah,
So
I hear
in
you.
that expression, right?
Yeah.
What will happen is 9 people can pay their debts, but it's mathematically impossible for that 10th person to pay their debt. No matter how hard they worked, no matter how honest they were, you can't pay $1,010,000 if there's only $1 million in your society.
Okay, so what are you trying to do?
Create a monetary system and
Okay.
lending system
All right.
that doesn't rely upon interest. It's like a good analogy is, you know what a Ponzi is?
I've heard about it.
Okay.
Heard about it.
A Ponzi is where, let's say I started a Ponzi,
Yeah.
and I said, hey, 8 people that I just met,
Right.
say, hey, each of you give me $100 a piece.
All right.
All right, I get $800, and I said the reason why you're going to give me $800 or $100 each is that as you progress through this pyramid scheme,
Yeah.
once you're 2 or 3 levels up, you're going to get $800 in exchange for that $100 that you paid.
That's a scam.
All right. Well, the reason why it's a scam
I
is
already know.
well, you eventually run out of more people to recruit.
Right.
It's a mathematic fraud.
It's about that fraud.
Interest is also a mathematic fraud.
Depending on.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
Now let's take a look at the role of the Rothschild family, the family said to be the wealthiest in the world. When Amschel Meyer Bauer inherited the business, he decided to change his name to Rothschild. Amschel soon learned that loaning money to governments and kings was more profitable than loaning to private individuals. Not only were the loans bigger, but they were secured by the nation's taxes. Mayer Rothschild had 5 sons. He trained them all in the skills of money creation, then sent them out to the major capitals of Europe to open branch offices of the family banking business. His first son, Amschel Meyer, stayed in Frankfurt to mind the hometown bank. His second son, Solomon, was sent to Vienna. His third son, Nathan, was clearly the most clever. He was sent to London at age 21 in 1798, 100 years after the founding of the Bank of England. His fourth son, Karl, went to Naples, and his fifth son, Jacob, went to Paris. Rothschilds soon grew unbelievably wealthy. By the mid-1800s, they dominated all European banking and were certainly the wealthiest family in the world. They financed Cecil Rhodes, making it possible for him to establish a monopoly over the diamond and gold fields of South Africa. In America, they financed the Harrimans and railroads, the Vanderbilts and railroads and the press, and Carnegie in the steel industry, among many others. In fact, during World War I, J.P. Morgan was thought to be the richest man in America. But after his death, it was discovered that he was actually only a lieutenant of the Rothschilds. By 1850, James Rothschild, the heir of the French branch of the family, was said to be worth 600 million French francs, 150 million more than all the other bankers in France put together. He built this mansion called Ferrier, just east of Paris. Wilhelm I, on seeing it, exclaimed, "Kings couldn't afford this. It could only belong to a Rothschild." Money changers, those who loan out and manipulate the quantity of money, were active in medieval England. In fact, they were so active that acting together, they could manipulate the entire English economy. These were not bankers per se. The money changers generally were the goldsmiths. They were the first bankers because they started keeping other people's gold for safekeeping in their vaults. The first paper money was merely a receipt for gold left at the goldsmith. Paper money caught on because it was more convenient than carrying around a lot of heavy gold and silver coins. Eventually, goldsmiths noticed that only a small fraction of the depositors ever came in and demanded their gold at any one time. Goldsmiths started cheating on the system. They discovered that they could print more money than they had gold, and usually no one would be the wiser. Then they could loan out this extra money and collect interest on it. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking. That is, loaning out many times more money than you have assets on deposit. So, if $1,000 in gold were deposited with them, they could loan out about $10,000 in paper money and draw interest payments on it, and no one would ever discover the deception. By this means, goldsmiths gradually accumulated more and more wealth and used this wealth to accumulate more and more gold. Today, this practice of loaning out more money than there are reserves is known as fractional reserve banking. Every bank in the United States is allowed to loan out at least 10 times more money than they actually have. That's why they get rich on charging, let's say, 8% interest. It's not really 8% per year, which is their income. It's 80%. That's why bank buildings are always the largest in town. When Queen Mary's sister, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne, she was determined to regain control over English money. Her solution was to issue gold and silver coins from the public treasury and take the control over the money supply away from the money changers. Oliver Cromwell finally overthrew King Charles, purged the Parliament, and put the king to death. the money changers were immediately allowed to consolidate their financial power. The result was that for the next 50 years, the money changers plunged Great Britain into a series of costly wars. They took over a square mile of property in the center of London, known as the City of London. This area today is still known as one of the 3 predominant financial centers of the world. By the end of the 1600s, England was in financial ruin. 50 years of more or less continuous wars with France and Holland had exhausted her. Frantic government officials met with the money changers to beg for the loans necessary to pursue their political purposes. The price was high: a government-sanctioned, privately owned bank which could issue money created out of nothing. It was to be the modern world's first privately owned central bank, the Bank of England. Although it was deceptively called the Bank of England to make the general population think it was part of the government, it was not. Like any other private corporation, the Bank of England sold shares to get started. The investors, whose names were never revealed, were supposed to put up £1.25 million British pounds in gold coin to buy their shares in the bank. The bank was duly chartered in 1694 and started out in the business of loaning out several times the money it supposedly had in reserves, all at interest. In exchange, the new bank would loan British politicians as much of the new currency as they wanted, as long as they secured the debt by direct taxation of the British people. So, legalization of the Bank of England amounted to nothing less than legal counterfeiting of a national currency for private gain. Unfortunately, nearly every nation now has a privately controlled central bank using the Bank of England as the basic model. Such is the power of these central banks that they soon take total control over a nation's economy. It soon amounts to nothing but a plutocracy ruled by the rich. The central bank scam is really a hidden tax. The nation sells bonds to the central bank to pay for things it does not have the political will to raise taxes to pay for. But the bonds are purchased with money the central bank creates out of nothing. More money in circulation makes your money worth less. The government gets as much money as it needs, and the people pay for it in inflation. The beauty of the plan is that not one person in 1,000 can figure it out because it's usually hidden behind complex-sounding economics gibberish. In 1790, less than 3 years after the Constitution had been signed, the money changers struck again. The newly appointed first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a bill to the Congress calling for a new, privately owned central bank. Coincidentally, that was the very year that Amschel Rothschild made his pronouncement from his flagship bank in Frankfurt. Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws. After a year of intense debate, in 1791, Congress passed the bill and gave it a 20-year charter. The new bank was to be called the First Bank of the United States, or BUS. The bank was given a monopoly on printing U.S. currency, even though 80% of its stock would be held by private investors. The other 20% would be purchased by the U.S. government. Like the Bank of England, the name of the Bank of the United States was deliberately chosen to hide the fact that it was privately controlled. And like the Bank of England, the names of the investors in the bank were never revealed. Many years later, it was a common saying that the Rothschilds were the power behind the old Bank of the United States. Here in Paris, the Bank of France was organized in 1800, just like the Bank of England. But Napoleon decided France had to break free of debt, and he never trusted the Bank of France. He declared that when a government is dependent upon bankers for money, the bankers, not the leaders of the government, are in control. This is the Waterloo battlefield about 200 miles northeast of Paris in what today is Belgium. Here Napoleon suffered his final defeat, but not before thousands of French and Englishmen gave their lives on a steamy summer day in July of 1815. The outcome was certainly in doubt. In fact, had Napoleon attacked a few hours earlier, he would probably have won the battle. But no matter who won or lost back in London, Nathan Rothschild planned to use the opportunity to try to seize control over the British stock and bond market and possibly even the Bank of England. Rothschild stationed a trusted agent, a man named Rothworth, on the north side of the battlefield, closer to the English Channel. Once the battle had been decided, Rothworth took off for the Channel. He delivered the news to Nathan Rothschild a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier. Rothschild hurried to the stock market and took up his usual position in front of an ancient pillar. All eyes were on him. The Rothschilds had a legendary communications network. If Wellington had been defeated and Napoleon was loose on the continent again, Britain's financial situation would become grave indeed. Rothschild looked saddened. He stood there motionless, eyes downcast. Then suddenly he began selling. Other nervous investors saw that Rothschild was selling. It could only mean one thing. Napoleon must have won, Wellington must have lost. The market plummeted. Soon everyone was selling their consols, their British government bonds, and prices dropped sharply. But then Rothschild started secretly buying up the consols through his agents for only a fraction of their worth hours before. Myths, legends, you say? 100 years later, the New York Times ran a story which said that Nathan's grandson had attempted to secure a court order to suppress a book with this stock market story in it. The Rothschild family claimed the story was untrue and libelous, but the court denied the Rothschilds' request and ordered the family to pay all court costs. What's even more interesting about this story is that some authors claim that the day after the Battle of Waterloo, in a matter of hours, Nathan Rothschild came to dominate not only the bond market, but the Bank of England as well.
And when the Jews rejected Jesus Christ, they became revolutionaries, because they rejected not only Christ, but Christ as the Logos, which is to say reason or order. The order of the universe as a manifestation of God's mind is what they rejected. Well, when you do that, you're a revolutionary. And so since that time, they've become this permanent body. I think this is what St. Paul is adverting to there. This permanent revolutionary body that's always spreading kind of dissenting ideas, subverting the morals of the Christian population, coming up with crazy theories that everybody thinks are great for about 5 years, and then suddenly everybody realizes they're stupid. That's the type of thing we're talking about.
A lot of people are revolutionaries, but what's unique about the Jewish revolutionary spirit is that the one thing that holds them together is their rejection of Christ.
Right.
Whereas the Hell's Angels don't define themselves by the common denominator is that they reject Christ. Because if a Jew does accept Christ, then they're kicked out of the synagogue. I mean, they're no longer considered a Jew, where they could become a Buddhist or an atheist.
Right. Yes.
So that makes them...
But I think what you see is, yes, there are all kinds of revolutionary groups out there. But I think what you see over the course of history, and that's what I pointed out in my book, is that these revolutionary groups invariably tend to take on Jewish characteristics. So the prime example from an American perspective would be the Puritans, okay, who were revolutionaries in England, decapitated the king, came over here, and then created a kind of revolutionary society over here based on mammon, devoting themselves to mammon. This is what Karl Marx said in Zur Judenfrage, which led to a revolution in this country. The Yankees were the revolutionary ferment, and then that led to a civil war and another revolution.
But they also had a theology that elevated the Jews. In other words, the Puritan hope was that Christ would come back at the same time, corresponding to a time period where the Jews would be converted back to their land, and converted,
Fully.
and their hope was fully set on a revival that would occur at this time. And a lot of people think, Cotton Mather himself said that's a crazy idea, but
Right.
it's complete.
Even though his father articulated that crazy idea. So yeah, it's still around. We still have Christians with crazy Jewish ideas. You know, the Christian Zionists, the dispensationalists. They're still around, big supporters of Israel. But what I'm saying is that this characteristic here, the Jewish revolutionary spirit, becomes a model for Christians as well.
Capitalism is different than a history of economic development, even though they do have similarities, because capitalism is a predatory ideology that preys on legitimate economic activity through usury primarily. And we've reached a point where people, if you say you're against capitalism, they say, well, don't you believe in economic development, or don't you believe in, you know, science, or don't you believe whatever. We have been so brainwashed that we've confused the disease with the person. The other aspect is that whenever capitalism runs into trouble, they loot. In America, they loot pension funds. That is always the first thing. And so you always have a capitalist saying, well, we can't afford Social Security anymore. Well, wait a minute. Why can't we can afford all these wars, but we can't afford Social Security? This is the penchant to loot labor. Usury concentrates wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And so a group like the Jews that is always a small minority will be interested in strategies that will concentrate wealth. They've also had centuries of experience in dealing with it, from small-time stuff to big-time stuff. And so they would naturally gravitate toward this. They have become experts in using these covert means of taking over the culture, using finance in a predatory way that is covert, and so most people don't see them as being
Then can you
involved in it.
explain how Islamic banking works?
We have in Culture Wars, my colleague Dave Wemhoff has done a really deep and extensive look into Islamic banking, and I'd be happy to send anyone a copy of this. It's long and complicated, but if you write to culturewars.com, jones@culturewars.com, I'd be happy to send you a copy of this. But in a sense, what we're talking about, the CEO summary here is that fees are legitimate, but compound interest is not. So you can charge fees for banking services, but you cannot charge compound interest. Because
so it's the fee is it's up front. It's not this on and on and on debt like we have today.
Right. Another article in Culture Wars magazine by one of our writers, Anthony Santelli, makes clear. He says $1 borrowed at the time of Christ at 5% interest. There aren't enough zeros in the world. I mean, this is an exaggeration. And if you go to, I can send you the Culture Wars article where we have the actual figure, but there aren't enough zeros in the universe to cover a figure this big. That is the intrinsic nature of compound interest, and that is why compound interest always destroys an economy. I don't think we need any more proof of this. It's all around us right now. Compound interest is going to destroy every economy on the face of the earth.
Can you explain in more detail about how compound interest works?
It's a mathematical formula. I mean, basically, it's just that, the interest that you earn gets added to the principal, and it builds in a geometric progression. Nothing grows in a geometric progression to keep fast enough to keep up with compound interest. The best example I can give you from the historical research I've done is from the chapter I've done on the Fugger family, which were the Catholic bankers who succeeded the Medici as the papal bankers. The Fugger family were the bankers for the Habsburgs, the family that was basically the premier family of the Roman emperors, the Holy Roman Empire. The Fugger family made their first loan to the Habsburgs in, I believe, 1494. Over the course of the next 70 years, the Habsburgs came into possession of all of the gold and silver mines in the New World. Now, this is an enormous amount of gold and silver at a time when gold and silver were money. That was the only source of money you had. If you wanted money, it had to be gold and silver. They had all of this, including all of the gold and silver that had already been mined and was used in ornaments, as ornament in places like Mexico by the Aztecs. All of this flowed into the coffers of the Habsburgs because Philip II, the Habsburg, was king of Spain, and he owned the New World. And yet, in spite of this, the Habsburg family went bankrupt in 1560. Now, this just shows you that if the Habsburgs, owning all the gold and silver, can't keep up with compound interest on the loan that they had to make to get elected Roman emperor, no force on earth, no productive capacity on earth can keep up with it. And so, therefore, we have to... Generally, when you say capitalism, people think, oh, you mean economic exchange. And so, therefore, if you're against capitalism, well, then you must be against economic exchange. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Capitalism is a perversion of economic exchange. Capitalism is economic exchange skewed to the interest of a certain group of people. And that's sort of what has to be sort of teased out of this historical discussion. Because basically what you had was a revolution in England that commandeered the economy and said from now on the economy is going to serve the interest of a certain group of people to the detriment of everyone else. Now that is the antithesis of what an economy is. An economy means the entire group of people in a nation. The nation is the parameter under which the economy works. The goal of the economy is the good of everyone in the nation. Now this is not socialism. You know, socialism is a reaction to capitalism. Socialism is the pus that forms when the body politic becomes sick with capitalism. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an equitable, a distribution of goods where the exchange benefit is maximized for everyone. That doesn't mean everybody's going to earn the same amount of money, but it does mean that you're not going to allow a certain group of people, namely the usurers, to freeze up the entire economy because for their benefit, which is the situation we're in right now.